a transformation so beyond rational understanding that its scattered and distorted reflections were mysteries in the keeping of reason-flaunting religions that have haunted human thinking since the dimmest beginnings. Running through my mind then, for the first time in years, was a childhood carol long forgotten. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie! Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by. Yet in thy dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. There was another aspect to the reveries in which I was immersed. This was something that I imagine is conventionally known as remembering previous incarnations. There was an influx of information about being another person in another time, but the time was fantastically ancient and the world portrayed without any historical validity. Perhaps these images come from the same depths that are the source, for some people, of the conviction that Atlantis or Lemuria once ruled a world no trace of which remains. My reincarnation memories were not of life as a citizen in one of those occult locales. Rather, my reminiscence was set in the mountainous heart of Central Asia. It was the age of these images that made me gasp, for even as the images filled my mind, an invisible presence was assuring me that this was a human existence lived out 8,000 years in the past. I recognized myself as a reflex of Tingi, the first shaman, a powerful magician and an inhabitant of Tibet 8 millennia ago. Not a primitive, but a technician of hallucinogens and crystals whose long gaze pierced into future time, even to the resolution of our little expedition poised on the brink of the perfection of the opus. It was as though I understood myself to be, on one level, the living reflex and tool of this eldritch ancestor, a super shaman actually in charge of the effort to recreate the ontological status that all shamans have always claimed, that of being able to travel to the stars and the places of the dead and return. That was the task of this Bön master, touching many events and minds in the long and meandering river of centuries. Such was the mood of the last tape. It told far more than I can remember. It was intimate and intense. I suppose that its loss was unavoidable, even as all that was happening to us seemed necessary, like the necessary fulfillment of prophecies.
Whoever issued up the tissue puts your brains made you strangely heartbreaking sweet life. Got an angel place where he ordered one sight. Whoever forced the gorge of your eyelids slightly, it's painstakingly twice. Shot a dangerous face with a gorgeous gun on the side. You've been away for far too long. Welcome to the whoever's doing it song. Whoever's doing it. Whoever conjured up the concert of your mountain made yourself of the boarding house gossip blow. Crack a spunky tongue monkey when he rapped that one shot. Whoever labored for the favor of your walk of the shock of his lordly like strut like slow. After you make a crack his tongue, joking going slots on one on his nut. You've been away for far too long. Welcome to the whoever's doing it song. find the fight you never been known. A bloody lover sailing after the blood on the ladder. Run, shine. Whoever scored the order of your view, who is noodling green, gold, doodling a blue to the bone, a good color with the fine surprise of a rising thunder like sun. Been away for far too long. Welcome to the weather stream song. Whoever's doing it. You've been away for far too long. Welcome to the weather's doing it song.
Chapter 10, More on the Opus. The next day, the 4th of March, dawned hot and clear. After we made breakfast, we did not tear down our fire, as would have normally been the case. Instead, we began to brew the carefully shredded Banisteriopsis caapi wood in several gallons of spring water. The fire made from the gnarled and now sun-baked roots burned furiously. The pot responded with an even rolling boil that is the correct condition for making the drug. All afternoon long we cooked and said little. Dave and Vanessa were to join us for a light meal early in the evening, and then they had agreed to withdraw from the group and allow the yahe taking and the experimental test of hypercarbylation to go on without them. I am sure that Dennis' mind, far more than my own, was preoccupied with the details of the test. During the days preceding, he had been often irritable, and this I took to be a part of the spectrum of effects accompanying whatever odd sort of mental unfoldment he was going through. While he was thus occupied with interior issues and vistas, I was the hawk-eyed guardian of the shamanic fires and procedures. There recently had been much discussion of fire and the role it must have played in forming the mental world of human beings. Once, as we sat staring into the campfire, Dennis had remarked to me that people have been looking into fires like this for thousands and thousands of years. The squeal of these coals is the release of ionized plasma, and into the flickering walls of waves of free electrons thus created, one can see into the past and the future. The fire is the place where the ideas come from. I was silent. I felt our ancestors then, seemingly present on the other side of the interface represented by the flame. What is happening to us? I asked it myself again, but said nothing, silence seeming more eloquent. Dennis wrote furiously part of the day as follows. March 4th. It is now possible to reconstruct the physical-chemical idea that has evolved in the process of understanding this phenomenon, i.e. the fourth-dimensional rotation of matter. I understand from examining the linguistic model we have constructed that the waveform ESR interference that will accompany the work operates in a somewhat different manner than I had thought. It can be explained thus. The psilocybin that occurs in the mushroom acts as an antenna for picking up and amplifying the harmonic ESR tones of all tryptophan-derived compounds of all living organisms within its range. Since the psilocybin undergoing metabolism is superconductive, this means that its range of reception is theoretically infinite, and the antenna does, to some degree, pick up a signal whose ultimate origin is the totality of living creatures. But since the psilocybin metabolism is carried on within the brain or mushroom at a very low voltage level, the antenna behaves as though its range was limited, even though it is superconductive. It seems clear, therefore, that the signal, which on the mushroom and in this ecologically dense area can be discerned so clearly, originates in the ESR resonation of the yahe plant, though perhaps all of the biosphere is picked up and broadcast amplified via the Yahe superconductive transducer. This understanding will clarify precisely what will occur at the moment of fourth-dimensional warp. Ingesting the Yahe harmine will speed up the process of metabolism enough to amplify its ESR tone to an audible level. This ESR tone will harmonically cancel out the ESR tone of the psilocybin within the mushroom, causing it to lose its electric field and snap into a superconducting configuration. The Yahe ESR signal will have keyed the mushroom psilocybin into a superconducting antenna. It is then ready to have the psilocybin harmine DNA compound being metabolized within the body, condensed onto its charged template. A microsecond after the mushroom psilocybin has been superconductively charged, its amplified ESR wave will then cancel out the ESR signals of the tryptamines and harmine metabolizing in the body, as well as the genetic material. This will cause these compounds to drop into a superconductive configuration and bond together at the exact same time that they bond to the waiting mushroom template. The transfer of superconductive compounds charged within the body to a superconductive template prepared within the mushroom will not occur in three-dimensional space. No actual physical transfer will be visible, as the organically processed superconductive material will bond itself to the mushroom template through a higher spatial dimension. The result will be the work of works, that wonder which cannot be told, 4 dimensions captured and delineated in 3. The stone will be all things, but the elements which are bound together in hyperspace to form it are among the most common natural products, and the function and place of each in the stone can be understood. The stone is a solid-state hyperdimensional circuit that is quadripartite in structure. First, psilocybin, charged in the mushroom to act as a template on which the rest of the circuit is condensed. In the final stone, the psilocybin acts as a superconducting antenna to pick up on information diffused through space and time. Second, the superconductively charged harmine complex within the stone will act as its transmitter and energy source. It is interesting to note that the same energy that sustains the antenna circuits in superconductivity will sustain the whole of the device. The third component of the stone is the DNA, bonded to and resonating through the harmine. It will constitute the hyperdimensional holographic memory of the device, and will contain and explicate the genetic history of all species. It will be the collective memory of the device, and all times and places and conceivable forms will be accessible within its matrix. The fourth part of the circuit will be the RNA, which will also be superconductively charged. Through its function of self-replication turned through hyperspace, the RNA will be able to project a waveform, three-dimensional holographic image, and thus it will give form instantly to any idea. It will perform the same function it has always had, the process of replication through time, but henceforth replication will be subject in part to the whim of consciousness. Why I and my companions have been selected to understand and trigger the Gestalt wave of understanding that will be the unleashing of the hyperspatial zeitgeist is becoming more clear to me each moment, though I know I won't understand our mission fully until the work is complete. We will be instructed in the use of the stone by some infinitely wise, infinitely adept fellow member of the hyperspatial community. Of that I feel sure. It will be the taking of the keys to galactarian citizenship. I speculate that we will be the first 5 human beings to be instructed in its use. Our mission will be to selectively disseminate it to the rest of humanity, but slowly and in such a way as to ease the culture shock. It is also somehow appropriate that at least some segment of the species have an intimation of the implications and possibilities of this, the last cultural artifact. And so now, against all probabilities and chance and circumstance, my companions and I have been given the peculiar privilege of knowing history will end. It would be a strange position to find oneself in if being in that position did not bring with it a full understanding of what forces it was that brought one there. Fortunately, as the phenomenon is an acceleration of understanding, one gains clearer insight into the forces that have bent space and time and thought and culture back upon themselves to focus them at this point. Now I can look back upon my life as spread before the scanner of memory and understand all those moments that foreshadowed this one. It is easy to look beyond the personal history to the events of history and discern therein the prefiguration of this last moment. As a phenomenon, it has always existed, and it will continue, for it is the moving edge of phenomenal understanding that was generated in the era before physics and has gathered momentum, a constant acceleration ever since. What we are moving toward in 3 dimensions is the passing of this wave of understanding into a higher dimension, the realm of the atemporal. As it happens, it will make this transition through one of us, but there will be no change in this cosmic order, or even a blip on the cosmic circuits, for the phenomenon has gathered constant momentum from the beginning, and it will flow through and beyond all dimensions with the same smoothness it entered, until finally it has moved through all being in all dimensions. Its joy will then be complete when in a vast amount of time it has constellated full understanding throughout creation. If we trigger the eschatology, we will appear to act in the role of the Antichrist, but the real Antichrist is history's distorted reflection of the Christ at the end of time, the cosmic Adam Anthropos. The eschatological Christ is Antichrist only from a historical perspective. It is interesting that among the Mazatecans the idea of Christ is linked to the mushroom. Is this syncretism or prophecy? That evening's collective meal with Dave and Vanessa at our camp with the Yahe infusion cooling in the background was less than successful, for by now positions relative to the phenomenon had polarized into irreconcilability. They arrived near the close of day and joined us in the hut for a smoke. Discussion led to an update and rehash of the experiment proposed for the evening. Dennis spoke. We will obtain a metabolizing living mushroom, dig up the shit around it, and physically move the whole thing to the hut. We want to do the bonding in the mushroom because we don't know what it would be like if it were done in our own bodies. It's wide open. With your voice, your mind, and a mushroom, these things can be done. That is all one needs. Accelerators, all of that? No. With the energy that is hundreds of times less than the energy in an ordinary flashlight battery, one can probably rend space-time apart. The air was heavy with charged ions. Dave was full of doubt. As he talked, there was the grumble of distant thunder far off over the jungle. Dave's objections to what we were doing were emotional and fearful, hardly what we expected from a colleague. We tried to be reassuring, but he became agitated and rushed out of the hut, perhaps, we thought, intending to walk back to the river house. Instead, we heard an exclamation of fear and a kind of moan, a yell for us. We all clambered out of the hut, to find Dave white-faced and staring at the sky, pointing. The light of a first-quarter moon revealed the tattered sky, and directly above the path returning to the river was an enormous black thunderhead rearing its twisting and writhing form up through thousands of feet of moisture and electricity-saturated air. It looked like an enormous whirlwind with broad strokes of lightning flickering out of its lower portions, touching the tops of the jungle canopy with a roar that was as deafening as field artillery when it broke over us. Over the roar of the wind that was now whipping the jungle all around us into a wild frenzy, I heard Dennis yell, "It's a reflection of the approaching breakthrough. It says to me there is now no doubt we'll succeed." From Dave a moan as he sank unbelieving to the sandy soil as the first huge drops began to fall. I thought of King Lear. In the wake of an ear-splitting blast, we all fell back to the hut. In a few minutes, the giant storm moved on, leaving only a chaotic and churning sunset. The sudden electrical storm and its impact on us was taken as an omen by all points of view. We assumed it was associated with a feedback of effects from the experiment, whose performance was now only a few hours ahead of us. Dave and Vanessa thought it a light dose of the wrath of God for having such Promethean aspirations. In returning to the hut to escape the onset of the storm, Vanessa had sprained her ankle by slipping from the notched log that served as the stepladder into the hut. "Is this the healing of my split T that my astrologer foretold for this time?" Scorpio Vanessa asked of no one in particular. Dennis ate nothing. Ev and I shared a light meal with our guests. They wished us good night and good luck and hobbled away toward the river. The three of us were then left alone, and there remained nothing for it but to make the test that Dennis had devised and whose anticipation had caused so much strain on our expedition. The yahe had been brewed. Through having seen ayahuasca brewed professionally by shamans in Peru since, I am sure that our brew was too weak to have had any major role in what happened. It was the mushroom that was the causal agent, if a causal agent could in fact be isolated. And mushrooms we had, both picked ones as well as specimens moved into the hut in situ in their manure bases. Living, metabolizing psilocybin and psilocin should be present, we thought. We had hung the chrysalis butterfly near the mushroom so that animal tissue undergoing metamorphosis should also be represented in the target area tableau. What was science and what ritual? We did not know and could not tell. They had become fused. Chapter 11. The Experiment at La Chorrera. The night was absolutely black. A low-lying cloud bank had appeared, muffling the small world of La Chorrera and wrapping it in a bowl of all-absorbing velvet darkness. Following the storm, we had rebuilt our fire and had driven off several liters of water from our infusion of Banisteriopsis caapi, so it was much strengthened over what it had been before. We then added crushed leaves that Dennis had gathered that day near the chorro, and which we were using as DMT admixture plants. We did this because we had tentatively identified these plants as Justicia pectoralis variety stenophylla, a plant commonly used as an admixture of yahe in the Valpais drainage. Now, years after that evening, I question both the concentration at which we brewed the Banisteriopsis and our identification of the admixture plant. There is no doubt that there was considerable harmine alkaloid in the infusion, but not so much as I later learned was necessary to provoke an unambiguous intoxication. The harmine alkaloids present were, in my opinion, boosted by the psilocybin accumulated in our systems, or rather, the MAO inhibiting effect of the beta-carbolines caused the residual psilocybin to emerge into consciousness as a deep hallucinogenic experience. While I completed the boiling, Ev and Dennis went to their hammocks and lay down to await the completion of the preparations. We laughed together and talked softly. Yet in spite of this, there was an undercurrent of tension as we approached the experiment into which so much of our energy had been poured. It was very critical. They were becoming very clumsy and seemed to find their bodies hard to handle. It was that which had sent them to their hammocks. I said that I would do whatever needed attention. Our little hut on its stilts looked in the flickering firelight like a small spaceship dropped into the howling jungles of an alien world. We all felt like we were approaching hyperspatial overdrive. There was a sense of immense energies accumulating. The effect was reinforced by the hammocks hanging like acceleration slings ready to receive a starship's crew. Dennis lay in his hammock, nearly unable to hold a pencil, but writing furiously in tight operational terms about the experiment just ahead. The mushroom is presently metabolizing within our bodies. This has keyed in on the tryptamine template in the living mushroom, and it has been sensitized for the condensation of the harmine psilocybin DNA molecule. When the yahe is ingested, the harmine analog will start to metabolize within the body. The ESR of the pre-sensitized psilocybin circuit will immediately cancel the ESR of the harmine and cause it to bond superconductively to the DNA-RNA complex both in our bodies and in the mushroom simultaneously in a higher dimension. The bonding completed, the harmine DNA memory bank and drive unit will condense into the waiting charged psilocybin circuit in the mushroom. We will see this condensation as it will appear in the mushroom at the same instant that the bond is completed in a higher dimension. We will see this condensation as it will appear in the mushroom at the same instant that the bond is completed in a higher dimension. Dennis explained that he was unable to move very well because something having to do with the backward flow of time and the ever-increasing constraints on the set of possible futures had rendered him nearly immobile. Only the mind, planning and computing, was free. I finished boiling the yahe. I ground the admixture plants and added them to the cooling brew. I moved the yahe into the hut, then the mushroom. Those things in place, we were ready to begin. Prior to this point, we had taken no hallucinogens for several days. The effects we were experiencing were not arising from that source. Something else was happening. Dennis was now narrating our countdown toward an omega point that none of us could really understand. We were completely transformed with the expectation that possibly we would witness the outbreak of the millennium. He said that time was appearing to slow down as we approached this point. As proof, or rather witness, to this amazing assertion, he called our attention to the candle that I had set upon a small shelf jutting from the wall of the hut. Unattended, its slight tilt had become slowly exaggerated, so that now it hung at a crazy angle, defying gravity because, he said, time was passing so slowly that we could not see that it was actually in the act of falling. I walked closer to this apparition and bent toward the flame. It appeared still, absolutely frozen. My mind shot back to the moment above the river when it too had seemed stilled forever. The flame was uncanny. As deeply as I cared to look into it, I could see no movement of particles or gas. We, or I, seemed to have my usual freedom of movement, but the world around me was coming to a crystalline and eerie halt. It was Dennis who finally spoke. A series of quantized energy levels have to be broken through in order to bond this thing. It is part mythology, part psychology, part applied physics. Who knows? We will make 3 attempts before we break out of the experimental mode. We all drank the yahe, sending it churning through our guts. Dennis took only one mushroom so that he could hear the tone. Darkness was utter, and we had no clocks. It seemed hours since Dave and Vanessa had left us. All was finally in readiness. The living mushroom, the harmine brew, the harmine smoking mixture. After we each had taken a half a cup of the yahe infusion, we settled down to wait. Dennis had been hearing the ESR tone that he deemed the sine qua non of what we were attempting for the past several days. After about 15 minutes, he announced that he could hear it more clearly and that it was gaining strength. He felt prepared to attempt the experiment at any time, he said. We agreed that each time during the actual making of the sound, we would extinguish the candle so that we would not have our minds burdened with any tryptamine-induced facial distortions that the odd yelling might cause. Years before, there had been episodes involving DMT and spasms of facial musculature that were fairly hair-raising for the observer, involving as they did the entities of Tantric Buddhism, the bulging eyes, the rolling and possibly long tongues, that sort of thing. Dennis rose up in his hammock then. The candle went out, and he sounded his first howl of hypercarbylation. It was mechanical and loud, like a bull roarer, and ended with a convulsive spasm that traveled throughout his body and landed him out of his hammock on the floor. We relit the candle only long enough to determine that everyone wanted to continue, and agreed that Dennis' next attempt should be made from a sitting position on the floor of the hut. This was done. Again, a long, whirring yodel, strange and unexpectedly mechanical each time it was sounded. I suggested a break before the third attempt, but Dennis was quite agitated and eager to bring it through, as he put it. We settled in for the third yell, and when it came, it was like the others, but lasted much longer and became much louder. It was like an electric siren wailing atomic attack over the still night jungle. Died away, that too was like the dying away of a siren. Then, there in the absolute darkness of our Amazon hut was silence, the silence of the transition from one world to another, the silence of the Gidneago Gap. and then the sound of the crowing of a cock, the cock at the mission. 3 times his call came, clear but from afar, seeming to confirm us as actors on a stage, part of a dramatic contrivance. Dennis had said that if the experiment were successful, the mushroom would be obliterated. The low-temperature phenomena would explode the cellular material, and what would be left would be a standing wave, a violet ring of light the size of the mushroom cap. That would be the holding mode of the lens, or whatever it was. Then someone would take command of it, whose DNA it is. They are it. It is a mind which can be seen and held in one's hand. It is indestructible. It is all space and time. The universe, but a monad, a monadic plasma, which contains all space and time, including one's own mind. Dennis leaned toward the mushroom standing on the raised experiment area. Look! As I followed his gaze, he raised his arm, and across the fully expanded cap of the mushroom fell the shadow of his Ruana. Clearly, but only for a moment, as the shadow bisected the glowing carpophore, I saw not a mature mushroom, but a planet, the Earth, lustrous and live, blue and tan and dazzling white. It is our world. His voice was full of unfathomable emotion. I could only nod. I did not understand, but I saw it clearly, although my vision was only a thing of a moment. We have succeeded. I don't understand. And I did not. Let's walk to the pasture. I need to think. Ev was exhausted by the night's activities and probably glad to have us leave her in the hut with the encroaching dawn promising some sort of new day. As we let ourselves down the log ladder to the ground, I was struck by the scene of utter confusion that our activities had left behind during the last frantic hours of brewing the night before. Our huge fire was now only white ashes. The waste from the haymaking was piled beside it, looking like a mound of beached seaweed. Everything seemed strewn about. This we walked through, shaking the stiffness out of our bodies and stopping at the small stream that crossed the path to splash water in our faces. We had not spoken. It was Dennis who broke the silence. You are wondering if we succeeded. Yes, what happened? Your writing heard on this effect, so what's going on? Well, I'm not sure how, but I know we have succeeded. Let me try to understand this. As we walked on, my own mind was racing with questions, and as we walked along, Dennis' occasional comments were, it burst over me, answers to questions that I was thinking but not articulating. I stopped in my tracks. I clearly formed a question in my mind. Dennis, head bent beside me, began to answer without waiting for me to articulate my thought aloud. I was dumbfounded. Was this it, then, I asked, that he had somehow acquired telepathic powers? No, there was more to it than that. According to Dennis, the bonding of the Harmine into his DNA had given him immediate access to an enormous cybernetically stored fund of information, and this information was freely available to anyone in the world who looked into their mind and prefaced their question with the word, Dennis? The absurdity of the second half of this proposition struck me as utterly too much. But naturally, at his insistence, I made the test. I picked up a small plant growing at my feet and closed my eyes and asked, Dennis, what is the name of this plant? Immediately, and without any effort of my own that I was aware of, a scientific name, now forgotten, popped into my head. I tried the same thing again with a different plant, and to my amazement received a different answer. The experiment seemed to secure that something was giving answers in my head, but I could not tell if they were correct or not. I was shaken. When we had left the hut on this walk, I was sure that we had failed, and that we had to talk over revising our approach. I even felt relief, since the obsessive nature of it all had been a strain. But now, as we walked along, and I could hear a voice in my head that was answering, however inanely or inaccurately, any question put to it, I was less sure. Dennis was oddly preoccupied, yet he assured me that his effort had succeeded, and that all over the world the wave of hypercarbolation was sweeping through the human race, eliminating the distinction between the individual and the community, as everyone discovered themselves spontaneously pushing off into a telepathic ocean whose name was that of its discoverer, Terence McKenna. As I watched my mind and listened to my brother rave, I began to realize that the experiment had indeed unleashed some sort of bizarre effect. Why it was that I was able to make the leap from assuming that we were having a peculiar localized experience to the idea that we were key parts of a mankind-wide phenomena is an important unanswered question, speaking volumes about my susceptibility to suggestion at that moment. I was quite simply the victim of a cognitive hallucination. That is, rather than a visual experience of something not actually present, a hallucination that is a total shift of the highest levels of our cognitive relationship to the world. The psilocybin-induced cognitive hallucination made the impossible and unlikely seem probable and reasonable. I was becoming flooded with ecstasy as the realization came over me that we had passed the omega point and that we were now operating in the first few moments of the millennium. Both of us could feel the excitement in us rising toward the realization that the world was now somehow radically different, totally different in a fundamental way. Dennis spoke.
So, this must be it. We have not condensed the stone into visible space, but we have generated it in our heads. It does not immediately appear as a visible vehicle, but first as a teaching. The teaching we hear in our heads right now. Later, the Word will be made flesh.
Flesh. I could only stare at my brother. Who is he, and how is he able to know and do these things? I could only wonder.
Now, Mother and possibly lots of dead people will be showing up soon. Young, he will doubtless come, and Einstein too, and by God, I want to hear what they have to say.
We were embracing each other and laughing. I felt as though I was being led like a little child. For no reason I had ceased to question. Rather, I felt an urge to see other people and feel their immersion in the new heaven and the new earth.